A German ace poured 21 cannon shells and over 200 machine gun rounds into an American fighter. Then he pulled alongside, gave a crisp military salute, and flew away, certain the plane was finished. The American landed in England. His crew chief started counting bullet holes at the tail. He gave up at 200. The plane was a P-47 Thunderbolt. Its own pilots called it the Jug. The Germans called it a flying barrel. Everybody laughed at it. In war, that's often the first mistake. Today's sponsor, Medal Hunter, is a military shooter built around the same principle. Never underestimate a well-placed shot. In each three-wave duel, you take control of weapons like flak cannons, artillery pieces, and sniper rifles. There's no auto-aim to do the work for you. You have to read the target's movement, judge the distance, and fire at exactly the right moment. Battles span 9 locations based on military history, from Pearl Harbor and Warsaw to Vietnam and Afghanistan, with naval, air, and ground combat. You can collect gunner cards, upgrade your weapons, build your haven, and climb the leagues with your club. Medal Hunter is available now on iOS and Android. Download it through the tracking link at the top of the description, or scan the QR code on screen. Once you're in the game, use Code War Genesis to receive 5 gunner commanders for free. If military history and skill-first competition are your thing, download Medal Hunter and give it a shot. But by the end of the war, one of Germany's top aces would admit, "We laughed at them in 1943. Nobody laughs now." This is why the laughter stopped. To understand why the Germans laughed, you have to see what they saw. Spring 1943, the Luftwaffe owned the skies over Europe. Their pilots flew the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf 190, sleek, fast, razor-thin machines built like falcons. Fully loaded with fuel and ammunition, an FW-190 weighed about 7,000 pounds. Light, agile, deadly. And then this thing showed up. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had a barrel-shaped fuselage, an enormous 4-bladed propeller, and a belly so deep and round it looked pregnant. It was a fighter the size of a small bomber. Its own pilots called it the Jug short for the 7-ton milk jug. Empty, it weighed over 10,000 pounds. Loaded for combat, it could push past 17,500. That made it the heaviest single-engine fighter of the entire war, heavier than some twin-engine bombers. The German FW-190 weighed about 7,000 pounds fully loaded. The P-47 weighed more than that, with nothing in it at all. When British pilots first saw the Thunderbolt, they joked that if a pilot slipped off the seat, he could fall down inside the enormous cockpit and hurt himself. American pilots said you could dodge enemy bullets by loosening your harness and leaning to one side. The cockpit was that roomy. A captured P-47 later confirmed the joke. Germany's chief test pilot, Hans Werner Lerche, a man who had evaluated over 125 aircraft types, climbed inside and froze. He wrote in his flight log that the cockpit could baffle an expert. He was used to the cramped Spartan Bf-109. The American cockpit overwhelmed him, automated turbocharger regulators, hydraulic flap controls, systems he had never seen before. But he admitted that flying it felt like flying in comfort. The Germans weren't impressed by comfort. Werner Schroer, a Luftwaffe ace, took one look at the fat silhouettes lumbering up from the west and called them flying barrels. His wingmen laughed on the open radio frequency, and at first, the laughter made sense. The Jug climbed slowly. It was sluggish at low altitudes. It turned like a freight train. When German fighters wanted to escape, they simply pulled into a steep climb. The heavy Thunderbolt couldn't follow. They'd zoom straight up, loop back around, and come in for another pass. But there was something hidden inside that fat, ugly belly, the very part of the airplane that everyone mocked, and it was about to change the entire air war. The man who designed the P-47 knew exactly how ugly it was, and he didn't care. Alexander Kartfeldy was a Georgian immigrant who had fled the Russian Revolution. His business partner, Alexander Deseversky, was a Russian immigrant who had done the same. Two men who escaped tyranny ended up designing the fighter that would help destroy it. Kartvelli looked at his creation and said, "It will be a dinosaur, but it will be a dinosaur with good proportions." He meant it as a compliment. The whole airplane was built backwards. Most fighters started with a sleek shape, and then the engineers figured out what engine to put in it. Kartvelli did the opposite. He started with the biggest, most powerful engine available, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. It was an 18-cylinder, air-cooled radial engine the size of a beer keg. It produced 2,000 horsepower. Then he added a turbo supercharger to the device that would let the engine breathe and produce full power at 30,000 feet, where the air was too thin for ordinary engines to function. But the supercharger was enormous. The exhaust gases had to be routed from the engine at the nose all the way through massive ducting that ran beneath the pilot's seat to the rear of the aircraft, where the turbine spun at over 21,000 revolutions per minute. At full power, those exhaust pipes glowed cherry red. A pilot's face would go numb from the -40-degree cold at altitude, while his boots baked against the floorboards from the heat radiating up through the ducting below. That ducting was the reason for the fat belly. That bulge everyone mocked was the exact thing that made the P-47 lethal at high altitude. And the engine itself served a purpose nobody on the German side had considered. That massive air-cooled radial sitting at the very front of the airplane was not just a power plant. It was a shield. Over a ton of cast steel and aluminum, positioned directly between the pilot and anything coming at him from the front. A rifle bullet from a German soldier on the ground would hit that engine block and bury itself harmlessly in the cooling fins. It would take a direct hit from heavy anti-aircraft fire to get past that wall of metal. Then, Kartvelli added the rest. 850 caliber Browning machine guns, 4 in each wing, 425 rounds per gun, self-sealing fuel tanks, heavy armor plate behind the pilot's head. By the time he was done, the airplane that was originally meant to be a lightweight interceptor had become the heaviest single-engine fighter ever built. There's an irony here that the Germans wouldn't appreciate until it was too late. The P-51 Mustang, the sleeker, prettier, more famous American fighter, ran on a liquid-cooled engine. It was an aerodynamic masterpiece, but one lucky rifle bullet through its radiator would drain the coolant, seize the engine in minutes, and force the pilot to bail out over enemy territory. The Thunderbolt had no liquid coolant to puncture. Pilots would fly home with entire cylinders blown off by cannon fire. The engine would vibrate violently, burn through its oil, and keep producing enough power to clear the English Channel. The ugliest thing about the airplane was the thing keeping its pilots alive. But none of that mattered if the pilots couldn't survive long enough to learn how to use it. The 56th Fighter Group was the first unit to take the Thunderbolt into combat, and their early days were rough. Dozens of crashes as men learned the temperamental machine. That massive torque from the engine tried to twist the airplane sideways on every takeoff. Pilots had to practically stand on the rudder pedal just to keep it straight down the runway. And the biggest problem was range. The Jug burned fuel the way its engine burned air voraciously. It could escort the heavy bombers only as far as the German border. Then it had to turn back. That meant the B-17s and B-24s flew the most dangerous stretch of every mission directly over the target completely alone. Unescorted, German fighters waited for the Thunderbolts to leave, and then they tore the bomber formations to pieces. Thousands of American bomber crewmen were dying over Germany, and the one fighter supposed to protect them couldn't follow far enough. If Republic Aviation couldn't solve the range problem, the P-47 was a dead end. The entire American daylight bombing campaign hung in the balance. But the Jug had one talent that nobody, not even the men who flew it, fully understood yet. One ability that was about to flip the air war on its head. It could dive faster than anything in the sky. To understand what came next, you need to know what it actually felt like to sit inside that airplane. Pilot Wheeler, a veteran who had flown the smaller P-40 Warhawk, described his first sight of the Thunderbolt. What a monstrous fighter. It outweighed his beloved Warhawk by 3,700 pounds. It stood 4 feet taller. It flew 100 miles per hour faster. On takeoff, the torque from that 2,000 horsepower engine was so violent that Wheeler said he had to practically stand on the rudder to hold it straight. The airplane fought you on the ground. But the moment the wheels left the runway, everything changed. Wheeler said the Thunderbolt became smooth and responsive. He said it gave him so much stability and confidence that I felt invincible. After the cramped cockpits of the Spitfire and the Bf-109, the Jug felt like flying in an armchair. Pilots described the seat as a comfortable lounge chair, and the spaciousness around them wasn't luxury. It was protection. That extra room meant heavy steel plate behind the pilot's head, thick enough to stop a 20-millimeter cannon shell. That protection mattered, because the Jug was about to ask its pilots to do something terrifying. The dive. At 30,000 feet, a Thunderbolt pilot would roll the aircraft over, point the nose straight down, and push the throttle forward. Gravity grabbed 10,000 pounds of airplane, and the 2,000 horsepower engine shoved it faster. The speedometer climbed past 400 miles per hour. Then 450. Then 500. Then the controls froze. The P-47 was so massive that in a full power dive it approached the speed of sound. The air flowing over the thick wings went supersonic before the airplane itself did, creating shockwaves that slammed into the control surfaces. The stick locked solid. The ailerons wouldn't move. The elevator wouldn't budge. Pilots called it compressibility, and there was nothing you could do about it. You were riding an 8-ton projectile aimed at the ground with no way to pull out. The only chance was to wait. If you had enough altitude, the thicker air at lower levels would slow the airplane, break the shock waves, and the controls would come back to life. If you didn't have enough altitude, you died. Wheeler heard a squadron mate try to test the limits. The man climbed to 30,000 feet and pushed into a full-throttle vertical dive. Wheeler heard it end as a loud, eerie, whining drone, then a loud thud, then stark silence. The controls had locked. The pilot rode the airplane into the ground. A fellow pilot offered the grim epitaph. He miscalculated by about 10,000 feet. But here was the dark genius of that death trap. The very thing that killed American pilots in the dive also saved them in combat, because no German fighter could follow them into it. The Bf-109 and the FW-190 were lighter. At those speeds and angles, the aerodynamic stress would tear their wings clean off. The P-47's sheer weight, the very thing that made it sluggish in a climb, made it the only fighter that could survive its own speed in a dive. The Germans could no longer escape by climbing away, because now the Thunderbolt would simply roll over and drop like a thrown anvil, and nothing on earth could catch it going down. The dive changed the tactics, but the guns changed the math. 8 50-caliber Browning machine guns, 4 in each wing. They converged at roughly 300 yards, meaning at that distance. All 8 streams of bullets met in a zone about 6 feet wide. A 2-second burst sent roughly 200 rounds into that zone. Not a spray, a wall. The combined rate of fire was 400 rounds per minute, over 100 rounds every single second. The bullets were armor-piercing incendiary. They burned hot enough to melt aluminum. Ace Francis Gabreski said that targets hit by a full burst didn't fall. They came apart. German fighter pilots were trained for precise, turning dogfights. Quick bursts, careful deflection shooting. When they faced the Thunderbolt diving from 30,000 feet at 500 miles per hour with 8 guns blazing, the experience was something else entirely. A solid wall of lead that could saw an airplane in half before the pilot even knew he'd been hit. And then, in January 1944, the last gap closed. The paddle blade propeller. The Jug's 2,000 horsepower engine had always been powerful enough. But at high altitude, in thin air, the original narrow propeller blades couldn't bite enough air to translate all that power into climb. It was like spinning tires on ice. The engine screamed, but the airplane barely rose. The Hamilton Standard 13-foot paddle blade propeller changed everything. The wider blades grabbed the thin air and turned the engine's raw power into thrust. The rate of climb jumped by 400 feet per minute. Top speed pushed to 470 miles per hour. Now the Thunderbolt could climb with them, and it could already outdive anything in the sky. And it carried 8 guns that fired 100 rounds a second. The Germans had lost their last advantage. If they climbed, the Jug followed. If they dove, the Jug was faster. And if they turned to fight, 850 calibers would cut them to pieces. June 26, 1943, late afternoon. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson was flying his P-47, a plane he'd nicknamed Half-Pint, on a bomber escort mission returning from Paris. His squadron was heading for the English Channel. Johnson was trailing the formation. That was when the Focke-Wulfs found him. 16 FW-190s came diving out of the sun. Johnson grabbed his radio. "Bandits, 5 o'clock. No reply. He called again. Silence. The first cannon shell exploded directly behind his headrest. The blast severed his hydraulic lines. Hot hydraulic fluid sprayed across his face, burning his eyes. A flash fire erupted inside the cockpit, smoke filling the space in seconds. More shells slammed and 20-millimeter cannon rounds punching through the fuselage, shredding metal, ripping holes in the skin of the airplane. Shrapnel tore into Johnson's thigh. A bullet nicked his nose. His eyes were raw from the fumes and the fluid. The airplane rolled into an uncontrolled spin sky, and earth whipping past the shattered canopy. Johnson kicked the rudder pedals with everything he had, fighting the massive aircraft back level. The speed of the plummet blew out the fire inside the cockpit. He was alive, but he was trapped. The canopy, the heavy glass hood over the cockpit, was jammed shut. The cannon blast had warped the frame. Johnson tried to bail out, but his parachute snagged on the twisted metal. He pulled and yanked, and it would not come free. He was locked inside a shredded airplane over occupied France with no radio, no hydraulics, and no way out. So he did the only thing he could. He pointed what was left of the P-47 toward England and flew. That was when the German appeared. A lone FW-190 with a yellow painted nose slid up behind the crippled Thunderbolt. The pilot closed in and opened fire with his machine guns. 7.9 2-millimeter rounds hammered into the P-47 from tail to nose. Johnson felt every impact each bullet transmitted as a physical jolt through the armor plate behind his seat, rattling his teeth, snapping his head forward against the shoulder harness. He kicked the rudder pedals wildly, trying to spoil the German's aim. But there was nothing else he could do. He had no speed to maneuver, no weapons to fire back. He was a target. Then the German did something strange. He stopped firing. He pulled up alongside Johnson's shattered airplane. He looked across at the battered fuselage, the holes, the torn metal, the smoke, and he shook his head in disbelief. Then he gave a crisp military salute. Johnson, dazed, bleeding, half-blind, gave an uneasy wave back. The German dropped behind the Thunderbolt and opened fire again. He raked the P-47 from tail to nose with machine gun rounds. Then he pulled alongside once more, stared at the airplane that refused to go down, and saluted again. He did this 3 times. 3 firing passes, 3 salutes between them. Chivalry and slaughter in the same gesture a warrior's respect offered between attempts to kill. Finally, the German fired his last round. He was out of ammunition. He pulled alongside one final time, rocked his wings in a mocking farewell, and peeled away toward France. Johnson flew the shattered P-47 across the English Channel and landed at Manston Airfield in England. Medics found him burned, bleeding, with shrapnel in his leg and a bullet wound on his face. But he was alive. Then they looked at the airplane. His crew chief started at the tail, counting bullet holes. He reached 200 without moving more than a few feet from where he started. He stopped counting. Across the entire airframe, inspectors found 21 separate 20-millimeter cannon shell impacts. Some of those shells had struck the armor plate just inches from Johnson's skull. 200 holes, 21 cannon strikes, and the Jug brought him home. Robert Johnson survived the war with 27 aerial victories, making him the second highest scoring American ace in Europe, behind only Francis Cabreski's 28. But Johnson's legend wasn't built on his kills. It was built on what his airplane endured that day proof, counted in bullet holes. That the Jug was something the world had never seen before, and the Germans were about to learn the same lesson on the ground. When the P-51 Mustang arrived in numbers and took over the deep escort missions to Berlin, the Jug was unleashed at low level. It became a dedicated fighter bomber, what the Germans called a Jabo, short for gag bomber, and it dropped from 30,000 feet to 50 feet off the ground. The P-47 carried 2,500 pounds of bombs and 10 rockets on top of those 8 machine guns. It attacked trains, trucks, tanks, armor columns, bridges, and supply depots. And it did this at treetop level, screaming over the French and German countryside at 400 miles per hour. So low that pilots had to dodge church steeples and high-tension power lines. Ground attack sounds simple. It was anything but. Strafing a German supply train meant diving at a locomotive at full speed just above the treetops, when those armor-piercing incendiary rounds punctured a steam locomotive's pressurized boiler. The superheated water inside, under immense pressure, instantly expanded to 1,700 times its liquid volume. The boiler didn't just rupture. It detonated. A blinding eruption of white steam, scalding water, and jagged iron shrapnel blasted outward in every direction. If the pilot didn't haul back on the stick the instant he fired, he would fly directly into the debris cloud of his own kill. Lieutenant Cliff Sari learned just how much punishment the Jug could absorb during a ground mission in November 1944. While strafing German rail cars near Oberstein, his P-47 took a direct flak hit to the engine, cowling. A chunk of metal tore away. The massive 18-cylinder engine began pouring thick, black oil directly onto the windscreen. Sari went instantly blind. He couldn't see the ground, the horizon, or his instruments. His wingman saved his life. For 50 minutes, guided entirely by his wingman's voice over the radio, Sari flew a crippled, violently shaking airplane 125 miles back to base completely blind. When he finally touched down, the ground crew found the entire forward fuselage coated in a solid layer of black oil. The engine had been bleeding to death for the entire flight. It flew anyway. If you're finding value in stories like this, a like goes a long way. That was the Thunderbolt. You could shoot it, burn it, blast it with cannon fire, and blind its pilot with its own oil. It did not quit. Colonel Hubert Zemke's 56th Fighter Group, the legendary Wolfpack, flew the P-47 for the entire war. They were the only 8th Air Force group that never switched to the Mustang. They didn't need to. By war's end, the 56th had racked up roughly 665 aerial kills and 311 ground kills. Pilots routinely brought home Thunderbolts with cylinders shot away, skin peeled off, control surfaces hanging in ribbons. And the German pilots, the ones who had laughed at the flying barrels, Heinz Burr, one of Germany's top aces, a man who had personally fought and shot down P-47s, gave this warning to his fellow pilots. It could absorb an astounding amount of lead and had to be handled very carefully. And Joseph Priller, the ace who had mocked the Americans and their fat, ugly fighters, finally admitted the truth. He called the Thunderbolt the perfect fighter, bomber. And he said the words that closed the loop on everything that started over Belgium in the spring of 1943. We laughed at them in 1943. Nobody laughs now. By the time the guns fell silent, Republic Aviation had built 15,636 P-47 Thunderbolts, the most produced American fighter of all time. In the European theater alone, Thunderbolt units dropped over 113,000 tons of bombs. They destroyed 86,000 railway cars, 9,000 locomotives, 68,000 trucks, and 6,000 armored fighting vehicles. They broke the supply lines that kept the German army fighting. The Mustang may have won the air war over Berlin. The Thunderbolt dismantled the German war machine on the ground. And it did all of it with the lowest loss rate of any American fighter, 0.7% per sortie. The ugliest, fattest, heaviest fighter in the sky was the safest one to fly. Despite being assigned the most dangerous mission type in the war low-level, strafing through the densest anti-aircraft networks on Earth, more Jug pilots came home than those of any other American fighter. Here's a number that says everything. The top 10 American aces who flew the P-47 in Europe all survived the war. Every single one of them. Robert Johnson came home. He lived until December 27th, 1998, 78 years old. Decades of quiet, peaceful life after the day a German ace emptied every round he carried into Johnson's airplane and watched it refuse to die. But history has a way of keeping score that doesn't always make sense. The P-47 Thunderbolt won its war and then faded from memory. The sleeker, prettier, longer-legged P-51 Mustang became the icon. The racehorse got the glory. The workhorse got forgotten. The Thunderbolt was never about looking good. It was about bringing men home, taking hits that would have killed any other airplane and flying on anyway, dropping into the dirt and the mud and the flak and doing the ugly, thankless, decisive work that wins wars. Two immigrants who had fled tyranny designed it. Its own creator called it a dinosaur. The enemy laughed at it on the radio, and it turned out to be the toughest, most devastating single-engine fighter the world had ever seen. A dinosaur with good proportions.